ahead and we'll get started. We are going to be making our way through chapter 19 in the book of Isaiah. Now, I say make our way through it. We're probably not going to make it all the way through chapter 19, but we are going to do the best that we can. But before we can dive into chapter 19, we must do what we always do and back up and cover chapter 18 because that's where we were last week. Now, last week, the vision was a little bit different because it wasn't just for the Israelites. Now, this vision was for the world. The world was going to hear about this one vision from Isaiah. And there was something else that was kind of interesting about this vision is we're not told what piece of land or what this specific name for this land was that Isaiah was going to be speaking on. He just said it was beyond the rivers of Cush. So this was this unknown land beyond the rivers of Cush. Now what was happening in this land by way of this vision? See, God was showing Isaiah that this land beyond the rivers of Cush was in panic mode. And why? Why were they in panic mode? Because of the Assyrian army. For this Assyrian army was powerful and it was taking over land left and right. Not only was it taking over land, but it was also taking people, enslaving others. So this piece of land hears about Assyria. They're worried about Assyria, so what do? They take their boats and they're going up and down the Nile River warning others, but they're not just warning others, they're trying to gain allies. Again, the Assyrian army was terrifying. There wasn't an army like this in the ancient time, not like the Assyrian army. But here's what is so interesting. This Assyrian army was wicked and evil, and yet who raised them up? God raised up the Assyrians. God is the one that put them in power. God was decreeing their path. Well, how is that? How is God decreeing the path of this wicked, evil army? Well, God didn't make the army wicked, nor did he make them evil. That is what they wanted. Within their fallen state, that was their choice. Their choice was never going to be God, but God decreed that he was going to bring up this wicked army to bring his wrath upon the people. So again, you can picture this piece of land, because we don't have a name for it, but they're sending out their boats, warning others, trying to gain allies. And what's so interesting about this piece of land is we see them doing the exact same thing that Israel did, that Jerusalem was doing. Remember what God told them in the beginning? He told them, do not look to a foreign nation for protection. Whenever you become worried about some army coming in to invade, don't worry about them. You depend on me. I will be the one to take care of you. And that's what God had done the whole time. Was it not God who rescued his own, that being the Israelites, from the Egyptians? They'd been enslaved for 400 years. God rescues them. God promises them that he's going to take them to the promised land, and that's exactly what he does. Not only does he take them to the promised land, he provides for them every step of the way. And now here they are in this land, and they have forgotten God. So here they are, God's own, relying on this pagan army to protect them. And this is the exact same thing this foreign land is doing. They're looking to others to protect them. Never did this piece of land bow the knee to God. Never did they pray to God for his protection. But the reason why this vision that was given to Isaiah was supposed to go worldwide is because God shows Isaiah that he is going to do something that only he can do. Remember, we're stressing just how powerful this Assyrian army is. There's not another nation that could stand up against them. And yet God tells Isaiah, you let the world know that I'm going to reveal my hand. But how does he do it? Does God do it in the light of day? Does God turn a mountain into a flaming ball of fire so that everyone can see it? Are there men walking on water claiming that God has given them the ability to do so? No. What God does, he does in the dark of night. And do we recall this story? Here the Assyrian army, over 185,000 men, are waiting to attack Jerusalem. And it's the dark of night. But what do we hear? God sends the angel of the Lord in the dark of night, and he slaughters 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Could you imagine God's own waking up that next morning? Here they are, terrified through the night, thinking, how in the world are we going to stop this army from coming in and slaughtering us? They wake up the next morning, and there's just piles of dead bodies. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers killed by the angel of the Lord. There was no battle, but the Assyrians were practically eliminated. Now again, the world was going to hear about this, and how was the world going to respond? Because the world was terrified of this Assyrian army. Terrified of them. And yet, could you imagine getting the word that the Assyrian army had been wiped out? That fear would be lifted. But what did the world do? Did the world praise God? And because Isaiah had made sure that vision was going out into the world, that prophecy was going out into the world, so it shouldn't have been a surprise. But still, man, the world did not bow the knee and thank God. They went on about their lives. Now we're heading into the oracle concerning Egypt. And we have to remember that by way of this vision, the Assyrian army has not been wiped out yet. They're still in power. Even though we just read how they're going to be wiped out, we're going into another oracle, and the Assyrian army is still ruling and reigning on the land. But why is God's wrath coming for Egypt? Well, Judah, God's people, were beginning to rely upon Egypt for protection. Judah was now looking to Egypt, this foreign, pagan land, to protect them. The promise had been made already. Do not fear any foreign armies coming upon you, for I will protect you. And yet, what does Judah do? They too forget God and turn to man. All right, let's dive into Isaiah chapter 19. Let's look at verse 1. An oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. Now, Egypt was an arrogant nation, very proud. And Egypt was a powerful nation. They were a wealthy nation. But Egypt was a godless nation. When I say godless, I mean they did not believe in the holy God. They had numerous false gods. They had enough to choose from. But primarily, their faith was in themselves. So here Egypt is. They were confident in themselves. They had these thick walls surrounding their cities. They had the Nile River separating them from their enemies. They had a powerful army. So they weren't worried. But what does God show Isaiah? Riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. Now it's not literally going to take place. But what God is showing the Egyptians is that it doesn't matter how thick that wall is, how many men you have that are wielding swords, or that Nile River that is surrounding you. God can get to you because he rules over all things. That very Nile River that you believe is protecting you, God can stop it and dry it up. I mean, he's already done this to Egypt once. We were called Pharaoh, right? Here they are. The Israelites are enslaved. Pharaoh's not going to let them go. The 10 plagues come upon them. Well, what were those plagues? It truly showed the Egyptians who the one and only God is, because every one of those plagues was a representation of an idol that Egypt worshiped, and God crushed every single one of those. So here God is reminding Egypt, I rule over every piece of this land. Not only this land, but this entire universe. Why? Because I created all of it, and not a single thing takes place that I have not decreed. So there is no stopping the wrath of God. And think about that. That should be terrifying even to believers. That there is not a single thing man can do to stop God's wrath. This verse continuing, and it says, and the idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence. Now again, I said that there were numerous false gods that the Egyptians worshipped. Why? Why were there so many? Well, they had to make sure they had all the areas covered. They worshipped the crocodiles. They loved the crocodiles, but they even worshipped onions. Yes, I said that correctly, onions. What a bunch of weirdos. I'm not an onion fan. And yet here God is, through this vision, is saying that once again he's going to prove to the Egyptians who the one true God is. And that their made-up gods do not stand a chance against the Holy of Holies. Do you understand what a false god is? Really, a false god is just man's pride. What man wants to do is take the attributes of God that he likes and form a god surrounding those attributes. That is a false god. That is a made-up God. The one true God that we worship, that rescued us, we are to love all of his attributes, and not just the ones that we like. I mean, we could focus on the loved one all day long, but you cannot neglect God's wrath. We are to love that attribute as well. Why? Because it shows his justice. All of the attributes we are to love. So look at what this says. So he's going after their idols. And then it continues and says, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. What is this talking about? Remember where their pride lies. One of the places in which they were so prideful was in their army. But here, through this vision, we're being told that the bravest of men will cower down. When you think about that, when you think about how God controls everything, even how a man approaches a battle, for he can turn the strongest of all the soldiers into weaklings. Now for some, this sounds as if you're going against the will of man. That's not right. How can God do that? No, that is right. God can do that because he is the Holy of Holies. When we speak of the sovereign one, that's God, not man. For it's God who controls all things, even soldiers when they go into battle. And here, we're being told that the Egyptian army, those men who normally have no problem wielding the sword, well, they will not be able to. And this is God's vengeance upon them. So we see here that God is making the mighty weak. Now look at verse 2. And it says, and I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight each against another, and each against his neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. We see here that God is going to turn an entire nation against one another. Friend against friend, family member against family member, and it will then spread to city against city and kingdom against kingdom. Now, when God is speaking of kingdom here, he's referring to the provinces of Egypt. But what he is saying is that no one will be safe, because the enemy isn't going to be coming from the outside world, it's going to be coming from within. This is how God was going to bring down the Egyptian empire, from within. Now, he's done that once, correct? And you look at the shape that we are in today. For the very United States is turning against one another. And now I pray, what I pray for is that there will be some type of revival that will change this. I mean, because that's the only way it's going to change, is by God doing that work inside of man. But right now, it does seem as if we are following in the footsteps of Egypt. Again, I'll continue to say this. I'm not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, but you just look around us today. You look at all the false idols within the United States today. You look at what the American worships today. It's not God. For we have created false idols, false gods. For America at one point in time was based upon Christian principles, but no longer. On that note, look at verse 3. It says, and the spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out. Now, we've already said this, that the Egyptians are an arrogant nation. They saw themselves as intellectuals, the ones who excelled in philosophy and liberal arts. They also considered other nations to be barbarians because they didn't have the same type of intellect as they did. So these other nations should just be thankful that they're able to do business with the Egyptians. But God was going to change that. God was going to change this so-called intellectual nation into a nation of barbarians, turning against one another. So no longer would the world look to Egypt as this strong intellectual nation, but they will now see them as the savages as they turn against one another. And who is doing this, church? God. God is turning the very people in Egypt upon one another. And again, you just think about that. How is he able to do this? This is how sovereign our God is, for he directs every step of man. He goes on to say, and I will confound their counsel. So not only is God going to take away how the Egyptians treat one another, he's going to turn them into barbarians, but he's also going to take the wisdom away from their leaders, from their councilmen. So we are seeing all throughout chapter 19 how God overrules man. And this is what I mean. at one point in time, they are friendly with one another. They can collaborate with one another. They're able to have discussions with one another. But God can change all of that. Does he force them? No. For man is fallen, and they want to do what their fallen mind wants them to do. So yes, they chose this route, and yet at the same time, it is God who's decreed it. Again, this is showing us that it is God who is the sovereign one and not man. And God does as he pleases because he is the holy and righteous one, not man. So here, this is going to be taking place in Egypt. The Egyptians are going to turn to their wise leader, their councilman, and they're going to say, "What do we do?" And the councilmen are just going to stand there looking at them and drooling because they don't have an answer. So where will they turn to next? And they will inquire of the idols. Oh, that's great. Let's go talk to an onion. Let's see what it can tell us. So here they are going to their false gods, but the false gods cannot answer. What they're going to receive from the onion is the same that they received from their mighty council. Absolutely nothing. For God has stripped them of their wisdom, and he's turning them over to what it is that they want, to their false gods. So then what next? Where do we go to next? Our wise council can't answer us. The crocodiles can't answer us. The onion can't answer us. What about the sorcerers and the mediums and the necromancers? This nation was never a nation that worshiped God. This is a nation that worships Satan. And you see that they cannot get the answers that they were looking for. And why is that? Because Satan cannot give man peace. For true peace and comfort comes only from the triune God. For what is and who is Satan? He is the father of lies. He can only deceive man. And yes, for a while this may be comforting. There's that moment of your sinful actions where there is a comfort, but it never stays. It cannot stay because it's wicked. And even though you don't believe in God, the same way the Egyptians didn't, there is no peace there. And there never will be. This is what happens when a nation has been turned upside down. This is what happens when your brothers turn against you. This is what happens when you cannot find comfort in the wisdom of your leaders. Oh my goodness, I mean, what does this sound like right now? This is what happens when your nation is crumbling right before your eyes. Because again, there is no comfort in evil. Now look at verse 4. It says, "And I will give over the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master, and a fierce king will rule over them, declares the Lord God of hosts." And you just see the power of God dripping from these verses. Even the kings that God gives man, he rules over. For there's not a single king, president, governor, mayor, councilman in the history of the world that God has not decreed to that position. And it's not as if God is reacting to man. It's not as if God is looking at the nation of Egypt and he's studying them and he's watching them and he's thinking, I got to do something about this. I've got to elect someone over them who is going to be cruel, who is going to be hard because of the way they're living. No, before the world was even planted, God had this planned out. It was already decreed. So he's going to give these arrogant men, these arrogant women, these godless people, a hard master, a fierce king. Again, I say, look at where we are today. Our king isn't fierce, though. He's demented. Now look at verse 5. And the waters of the sea will be dried up, and the river will be dry and parched. Remember how it is that Egypt makes money and what it is that protects them. It's the waterways. What is it that nourishes the very ground that the seeds are planted in? It's the waterway. And what's God saying? Through my grace and mercy, I gave them that. But in my wrath, I can take it away. Verse 6, and it says, and its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Nile will diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away. Everything the Egyptians need to survive, God is stripping them of it. And why? One reason is that Egypt is a godless nation, and God's wrath will come for the godless. It's going to happen. That's the way it's going to end. But also, notice what God is telling Judah. So this is who you want to run to? The very ones who cannot protect themselves? The very ones that I strip of everything that I have given them, and this is who you want over me? So I will take from them to prove my point to you, O Judah. Now you may sit there and think, well, that doesn't seem very nice. That doesn't seem very polite of God to strip Egypt of everything that they have because Judah is considering them. Again, I say, what God are you worshiping? If you think that your ways are better than His, then I ask you, what does sovereign mean to you? Church, we have to realize that God can and does as He pleases because He knows the beginning and the end, and what matters is that He is glorified. So everything that comes to pass is for His glory. And we see this taking place here. That may be a good stopping point. Question.